Hi, Year 10. It's Mr. Azzopardi with a video about just war theory. This is the second video I've done on the Religion, Peace and Conflict unit. So, as the title says, we're going to explain and evaluate the Christian teaching of just war theory. In this lesson, there'll be quite a lot of notes that you'll need to take. So you need to have some paper and you'll be writing down the key things that I talk about. Obviously, take advantage of the fact that it's a video. You can stop and pause and go back if you need to. I guess when you're making your notes, best thing to put a title in. We're going to explain and evaluate. So we're going to look at what this theory is, and we are going to evaluate it, look at how it can be criticised. And I am going to talk you through how to put this into an SEE+E paragraph as well. So just war theory is the most famous theory amongst Christians about going to war. It's not based on simply a quote from the Bible. We'll look a little bit about how that theory has come to be set up and how Christians have come to believe in it. But it's worth saying that the theory itself, the sets of rules that it gives about when you can go to war and how you should behave at war and how you should behave after war, is not specifically Christian, although it comes out of Christianity. There are lots of people today who follow that theory about war, but are not Christians themselves. So it comes out of Christianity, but it's come to be more than just a Christian theory. So here's a bit of background. You need to take notes, make notes of the key points from this slide. So just war theory is a set of ideas about when it's acceptable for countries to go to war. There's a typo there. It says to go to was, should be go to war, and how countries should behave during a war. It has its origins in Catholic Christianity, so it comes out of Catholicism, the Catholic Church. And this is how it happened. So the earliest Christians, by and large, were pacifists. We saw in the last lesson that Jesus was mainly pacifist in his teachings. That means he was against violence. And the earliest Christians did not really take part in violence and war and things like that at all. However, it's worth saying that they didn't really have any big decisions about going to war to make, those early Christians, because they were a very small group. It wasn't at that stage with the earliest Christian communities, it wasn't the religion of the whole country or anything like that. So there weren't any people who were following their religion who were in the position to decide whether to go to war. So some people say, oh, well, Christians could be pacifist because the earliest Christians were pacifist. But then you could argue that, well, those earliest Christians, they never really had to make a big decision about war. It's not like the earliest Christians were in a position where they were the rulers of a country and that country was attacked by another country and they had to decide whether to fight back. No, they were a small minority. Yes, they didn't go to war and they tended not to join the army. But yeah, you can think of good reasons, I suppose, to say why just because they were pacifists, later Christians don't have to be pacifists. Anyway, that's a bit of a rambling point. The point is that in the 4th century, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under the Emperor Constantine. So Christianity grew up in Israel originally, and then it spread throughout the Roman Empire, which was the biggest empire in the world at that time. And for most of the early history, Christianity was an oppressed religion, so the rulers of the empire didn't like Christianity. That he was crucified by the Romans, and the early followers of Jesus were also attacked and sometimes killed for their beliefs. But this all changed dramatically with Emperor Constantine, who became a convert to Christianity, and kind of under him, Christianity went from being this small religion to being the number one religion of the empire. Now then you face this problem. So a religion that was previously quite against war is now in the position of being the main religion of the empire. Well, when you're the main religion of the empire, you have to think more carefully about questions about when it's right to go to war, because an empire needs to be defended. An empire needs an army. If you're the main religion of an empire, you've got to give advice about, is it okay to go to war? When can we go to war? In which situations is it all right? So it's at this point that the idea about, well, how do we think about war from a Christian point of view becomes a really pressing concern. In other words, it becomes something that people start to think about a lot. People start to think seriously about, okay, we're Christian. Jesus said that war is wrong, or Jesus said that violence is wrong. Jesus said turn the other cheek. But on the other hand, don't you sometimes have to go to war? Aren't there some situations where you need to go to war? And this is a kind of thinking that made Christians develop these rules. It's a kind of, maybe just war theory, it's a midway point between the fact that Jesus was against violence and the fact that, well, in real life, in everyday life, you sometimes, if you're running a country, you have to use violence. So they try to kind of, in the end, come up with a set of rules that says, okay, sometimes you have to go to war, but there are very strict conditions in when you can go to war and how you behave during war. The first Christian thinker to develop a just war theory was St. Augustine. We've talked about him before when we did Problem of Evil. He was the first one to really come up with a theory, but he didn't come up with a full theory of just war theory as we have it today. He came up with the basics of the theory. Later Christian thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, who he's also looked at before, who lived in the 13th century, developed the theory further, so he made it more detailed. Today, just war theory is not only a Christian philosophy. Many non-religious philosophers have adopted and developed the theory. And the form of just war theory we're going to look at today has been developed even since Thomas Aquinas' time. So there's some rules that people would follow today which weren't in even Thomas Aquinas' version of just war theory. Now, before we get onto the rules of just war theory, we're going to look at how Catholics, because it was originally a Catholic set of rules, can justify war. Because you might think, well, Catholics follow natural moral law. Natural moral law involves the idea of preserving life. Going to war is going to involve killing people, and so it seems to go against natural moral law. It seems to go against that purpose of a human being, and natural moral law says anything that goes against the purposes of a human being is wrong. So that's when we're going to come on to something called the doctrine of double effect. So you need to make some notes from this slide. It might be that you need to write everything on this slide down, or just enough for you to understand it, I suppose. So within the Catholic Church, the use of violence in just war theory is justified by using what they call the doctrine of double effect. This is actually something we're going to talk about again when we look at the lessons, not in this unit, in a different unit, on abortion. It's also a reason, doctrine of double effect also explains why Catholics, although they're usually against abortion, do allow abortion in certain circumstances. So Catholics say, if the primary goal of your actions is to kill, makes it a wrong action because it goes against one of the 5 purposes of natural moral law, that purpose being to preserve life. However, the doctrine of double effect says that if the primary goal of your action is good, it can be accepted even if it has bad side effects. So if you think about it, if you go to war and your main reason for going to war is to kill people, that is bad, and so it's not acceptable because you're not preserving life. However, if we go to war to save innocent lives, in other words, you go to war to protect the innocent people of your country who are being attacked, or say you went to war to stop people in a certain country from being killed. Say if we had gone to war for the purpose of, in World War II, for the purpose of ending the concentration camps and the Holocaust, that would be a good action because it goes along with the purpose of preserving lives. The doctrine of double effect says, well, that means if that was our main purpose in going to war, preserving life, then we can accept the fact that it has some bad side effects. For example, we will lose some lives during the war. It's a tricky idea, but what it's trying to get across, I suppose, is the fact that you have to think about what is the main purpose of what you're doing. If the main purpose is to preserve life, then we can accept that it also involves taking some other lives. If the main purpose was to take lives, if our main purpose was to kill people, then it could never be right. But if our main purpose was to save another group of people, and to save that group of people we had to take the lives of some people, then that would be acceptable. So that is how Catholics get round that idea of, from the first, it first seems like war should be unacceptable because it goes against preserving life. They get around that with the doctrine of double effect, so they say it can be acceptable. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the different kinds of rules that you have in just war theory. So this is where we get onto the theory itself. So you'll need to put 3 headings, and those are the headings that are on the screen right now. These are the 3 sets of rules you have. So there are lots of rules in just war theory, but they come under certain headings. Three headings, and they're all known by Latin terms. It's great if you can know the Latin terms because it enables you to show off in an exam question. They are jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and jus post bellum. The J is a soft J, so that means it sounds like a Y. That's just how they pronounce it in Latin. So I'm just going to go through what each of these means, and then for each one we're going to put the title, the set of rules of title, and then write down the rules that come under that set of part of the theory under that heading. So jus ad bellum, the first one we're going to look at, is rules about when it's right to go to war. So when can you go to war in the first place? When is it okay to have a war? Jus in bello are rules about how you should act while you're at war. So once you've made the decision, jus in bello says there are certain things that you can't do while you're at war. There's certain things that even once you've decided to go to war, there's still certain things that are just completely wrong. You can never do. Jus post bellum are rules about how you should act after the war is won. So if you go to war and you win the war, it says there are certain things that you should do after you've won the war. So let's go. So if you first put down this heading, jus ad bellum, rules about when it's right to go to war. Here are some of the rules. I should say these rules I'm going to give you here are not completely exhaustive. Some versions of just war theory have more rules, some have less, but these are the ones I'm going to go through with you. Okay, here are 4 rules that are part of jus ad bellum, when it's right to go to war. First one, just cause. A war should only be started for a good reason. This generally includes self-defense or protecting people in another country who are being attacked. So if your country's being attacked, you need to defend yourself. That's a good reason. If people in a country is attacking a set of people in their own country, like Hitler did during World War II and before World War II, then that would be a just reason, a good reason to go, because we're protecting innocent people. Those are generally seen as the only reasons it's okay to go to war: self-defense or protecting other people. Any other reason, so for personal gain, to gain land for your country, to gain resources for your country, all those sort of things are seen as bad reasons for going to war. Okay, second one, just authority. That means that a war can only be declared by the person who's got the authority, the power, the right power in the country to declare the war. That would generally mean a king. A king or emperor, that was when the theory was first created, because that's how most countries were ruled then. So a king or emperor, or in modern times we'd say the government, the elected government of the country. So only they can declare a war. That means that if the army itself or the rulers of the army, who are not the actual rulers of the country, decide on their own to go to war, it wouldn't be a correct war according to just war theory. So just authority. Only the king or the government can declare war. Thirdly, last resort. This is the idea that before a war is started, you must try every other way of dealing with the problem. So in other words, you must try to reach a peaceful solution to this conflict. So say if some country is acting in a way that you're not happy with, so you might have some good reason to go to war, they're treating their own people badly. Well, first you're trying to negotiate. Secondly, you might try to impose economic sanctions. Economic sanctions means things like you will not buy any products from that country. You will not send any economic aid to that country, like money to help people in that country. You will forbid people in your country, companies in your country, from doing any trade deals with that country. All those kind of things. The reason you do those things, economic sanctions, is to try and put pressure on that government. That will lose the country money, and therefore they might stop doing that bad stuff that they're doing in order to stop losing that money. So the idea is you must try all these different things before you go to war. It's only when violence is the only option left that you should go to war. Fourthly, this is an interesting one, reasonable chance of success. It should be possible to win the war. You should be able to think that you've got a reasonably good chance of winning the war. Of course, you cannot know exactly whether you're going to win or not, but you should have a pretty good chance of winning. The whole point here is that there's no point going to war if you know you're going to lose. There would be no point in it, which wouldn't create any benefit for anyone if you're definitely going to lose. So those are the 4 rules about when you can go to war. You can go to war if you've got a good reason to go, if the war has been declared by the government or the king of the country, if it's the last resort, you've tried everything else, and if you've got a reasonable chance of being successful in the war. Okay, so this is the second set of rules, which are the jus in bello, rules about how you should act while you're at war. So, you can go to war if you've meet all the rules of jus ad bellum, but even if you go to war, you still have to follow these rules while you're at war. So number 1, avoid civilians. This is nice and straightforward. Only soldiers on the other side should be attacked during war. It is wrong to attack normal people who are not fighting in the war. So you cannot just go and randomly bomb innocent people in that country. You attack the soldiers on the other side, not the innocent civilians on the other side. Civilians are people who are not soldiers. Nice and straightforward. The second one, necessary force. During a war, we should only use as much violence as we need to win. We should not cause more death and suffering than we have to. So, if you should use the amount of violence you need to finish the war and stop the other side from hurting innocent people, but beyond that, you shouldn't use any more violence. You shouldn't just, take revenge on them by, killing thousands of their soldiers in some kind of revenge. If you don't need to kill thousands and thousands of their soldiers, you should only have to kill the number that you need to win the war. So that's that one. So these are the 2 things. You shouldn't target civilians, people who are not soldiers, and you should only use as much violence as you have to. You shouldn't be killing millions of their soldiers if it's not necessary. Okay, jus post bellum is the last set of rules, and this is a relatively recent addition to just war theory. The original just war theory did not include rules about how you should act after the war is won. But increasingly, philosophers have thought that, that actually there are some things that you should do after you've won the war. You shouldn't just defeat the other country and then just leave that country in chaos. This is particularly something people have thought about in recent years because of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And sometimes there were feelings that, that sometimes in those wars that after they were won, after the British and the Americans were victorious, getting rid of the rulers of those countries, they didn't do enough to make sure those countries were left in a stable situation, and that led to more chaos and more problems down the line. So here's 2 rules in jus post bellum, things you should do after the war is won. Number 1, retraining. The police and the military of the defeated country must be retrained so that they can protect law and order in the country. A country that has lost a war should not be left to descend into chaos. So, say there's a country you got a war with. Say it's killing people. There's a government that's killing people in its own country. You go into that war. You get rid of the rulers who are there. Now, as part of that war, you may have had to destroy the military and a lot of the police in that area, because those are the people some of the people who might be involved in fighting against you. The problem is if you destroy the military and police of a country and then leave, then the country has no one to protect law and order in the country, and there could just be crime everywhere. People in that country wouldn't be safe anymore, and so on and so on. So the idea is that if you beat that country and you defeat them, you should remain in that country. You should keep your police or army in that country to retrain their police and military, so that country can become a safe place again after the war. Secondly, punishments. People guilty of war crimes, action which go against the rules of how a war should be conducted, must be brought to trial and punished. So, for example, if there are people in that country who you go to war against a country, people in that country who were in charge of large-scale killings of civilians. We've said that killing civilians is wrong. Those are called war crimes, and the idea is that instead of just beating the country and leaving, you should find the people who've committed those war crimes and bring them to justice. Make sure that they put on trial and punish for what they've done wrong. So those are two things that you're supposed to do after the war is won. Okay, so now you have the three sets of rules in just war theory and the different rules within those categories. And now I'm going to talk about how to evaluate it. So, we're going to look at ways in which it could be criticised. I'm just going to go through a few. For this, you need to make notes on them, but you're going to have to base it really on what I'm saying rather than what's on the slides, because I'm going to kind of speak about these things. I'm going to give you some examples to show why we might criticise it, because often people find it difficult to criticise just war theory. They just think, well, those rules all sound correct. But let's have a look at some of these things. Well, there's the name of a film. I can't pronounce it because it sounds rude. This film was made by Quentin Tarantino, and it is about a true story about the fact that in Nazi Germany, some Jewish people attempted to use violence to attack the Nazis. I've put the question, were they right to do this? Now, obviously, most people would say, yes, of course they were right to do this. It's a good thing that they tried to rise up and fight against the Nazis. However, the interesting thing is it breaks a number of rules of just war theory. Number one, it breaks the idea of just authority, because it says in just war theory that only people who can declare war are the king or a government of the country. Now, the government of the country were the Nazis. So according to just war theory, it's not right for the Jewish people to declare the war, to use violence against the Nazis. But obviously that's wrong, because the Nazis were a terrible government. So that could be a good criticism of just war theory, that just war theory doesn't allow a group within a country to attack their own country. And sometimes that must be the right thing to do, because if the country's run by a terrible dictator like Hitler, then surely it's right to use violence to get rid of him. So that's one problem with just war theory. Just authority, we can see a problem with that one. Secondly, the people in this uprising against the Nazis probably did not have a reasonable chance of success. There was no way for them to win. It was impossible for them to win. But some people would say, but it's still good that they tried, because it's a matter of pride, or it's a matter of, what else can you do? When there's no other option, it's better to fight than just to accept your fate. So, again, we might say reasonable chance of success. Maybe there are some situations in which you should fight, even if there's not a reasonable chance of success. So yeah, there's two criticisms of just war theory in one there. If you're thinking about the idea of just authority, the idea of a war within a country is known as a civil war, a war where two groups fight for control of the country. And, in effect, just war theory says that you can't have a civil war. You can't go to war against your own government. And that does seem to many people to be wrong. Sometimes you need to go to war against your own government. Okay, here's a picture of some people working in a munitions factory. Munitions factories are factories that make bombs and ammunition and other things that you need to fight a war. Now, the question was, are you allowed to bomb this factory? Well, according to just war theory, I guess the answer is no, because these people are civilians. They're not soldiers fighting in the war. But this factory does play a part in the war effort, trying to, the bombs that they make are helping this side of the war. So many people would say, hold on, there's times when it should be okay to bomb a munitions factory. You should be able to bomb a factory like this. These people aren't soldiers, but they're taking part in the war effort, so it's legitimate to target them. And so I suppose what I'm trying to say here as a criticism is that the idea of avoiding civilians is quite tricky, because it's hard to know exactly who counts as a civilian and who doesn't. Are people who make bombs in a bomb factory civilians or not? So there we go. That's another criticism. There's another one. You're fighting an enemy country which will not stick to the rules of just war theory. They will bomb civilians and use as much force as they have to. Should you stick to the rules of just war theory? So you could say, well, hold on, what if the other side is bombing civilians left, right, and centre? And I feel like, well, the only way to beat them is to start to attack civilians in their country. Should we do that? If, for example, in the Second World War, the Germany didn't stick to avoiding civilians. It bombed, in the Blitz, it bombed people in cities, innocent people, civilians in cities in England. In return, the British bombed civilians in the city of Dresden in Germany. So they did what's called carpet bombing. They just bombed everything, not just military targets, but everybody. And, many people were killed. Now, it could be argued that, well, we've got a ruthless enemy in the Germans who will just do anything to win this war. Surely we should do whatever it takes to win the war. And, for example, in the bombing of Dresden, some people felt like that was really helpful. It would be really helpful in winning the war, because the more civilians are attacked, the more chance it is that the people of Germany would go against Hitler and think, we should give up this war. We're never going to win. So some people say, well, yeah, if you're fighting an opponent who won't stick to the rules, you shouldn't stick to the rules either, because you've got to beat them. So that's something to think about. The USA said that it went to war with Iraq because its leaders were treating their own people badly and supporting terrorism. However, some people think the real reason for the war was that America wanted access to Iraqi oil. This was a very much heard criticism at the time of the Iraq war. People felt like people weren't being truthful about their reason for the war. Now, whether that's true or not is not really what I want to discuss here. But the fact that question was always asked raises a good problem with just cause. Some people would say that the whole idea of just cause, the idea that you need a good reason, there's a problem there, because people sometimes lie about their reason to go into war. Sometimes people say we're going to war for one reason, when their real reason is going for another. Their real reason for going to war is something else completely. So I suppose that's a criticism of just cause. That it's very easy to make up a reason that goes along with just cause, even if your real reason for going to war is something else. Okay, so there's some criticisms, with just war theory. I think the strongest one's probably just authority, the fact that civil wars aren't allowed. Seems to be the biggest criticism to me, when sometimes civil wars are the right thing. Okay, so what I want to do is talk about, and I want you to write this up, how you might put this into a 15-mark question. So here's a possible 15-marker. War is always wrong. Discuss this statement. I'm going to go through, if we were doing this in a normal lesson, I would just put the sentence starters on and we would talk it through as a class. But as it is, it's just me, so I'm just going to tell you how I'd finish them. So I'd say a Christian who follows just war theory would, and of course they would disagree with the statement. So that's all I'd say there. A Christian who follows just war theory would disagree with the statement. The difficulty about the E part is that you can't write up the whole of just war theory. You can't write up every rule, because that would just be confusing. And there's no quote. So here's what I would do. I'd say this. Just war theory was developed by the Catholic philosophers St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. It gives rules to follow about. And then I would explain the 3 categories of rules. So it gives rules to follow about when you can go to war, how you can act during a war, and how you should act after you've won the war. If you can remember them, it's really good to put in brackets there the Latin terms. So it gives rules to follow about how you act during a war. No, gives rules to follow about when you can go to war, jus ad bellum, how you can act during a war, jus in bello, and how you act after you've won the war, jus post bellum. Just put them in brackets afterwards. Now, so far you haven't actually said any of the rules of the theory, but that's what I do in the next bit. So I'd then explain, this means that a follower of just war theory would think that it's acceptable to go to war if, and then I would use 3 examples of the rules. So I'd say, acceptable to go to war if it's a last resort, if you don't attack civilians during the war, and if after you've won the war, you will retrain the army and police of the country that's been attacked. See, I've given an example from each category of rules. I think that just makes the whole explanation neat. And you don't need to have every rule, but if you've got those three and you've said the three categories, then that really shows that you shows the person reading it, this person really knows about just war theory. That'd be enough information to show your knowledge. So yeah, I mean, the three you pick is not that important. So you could say this means that a follower of just war theory would think that it's acceptable to go to war if, say, there is a good cause to go to war, such as you're defending your own country. If you only use reasonable amount of force during the war, you don't use more force than you have to, and if you make sure that people who commit war crimes are brought to justice after the war. Then you put a criticism in. Now, you could use as your criticism, you could use some of the criticisms we've just seen. So this issue could be criticised because, well, just war theory doesn't allow civil wars, and people might think that civil war is okay. But the problem with that is that, look, the statement is war is always wrong. Discuss this statement, and that your criticism is really about, is just war theory a good theory? The key thing here is that just war theory is saying that no, war is not always wrong. So it's better to have a criticism that will say, that will go back and say, no, war is always wrong. The easiest way to think is to go back to what it says in the Bible. Jesus was a pacifist. Jesus didn't think war was right. So the easiest way to put a criticism of just war theory is to say, well, it's going against the pacifist teachings of Jesus. So I would say something like this. This view could be criticised because Jesus, in the Bible, Jesus taught that violence is wrong, even if you're being attacked. For example, he said, if someone attacks you, do not fight back. If they hit you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. So, in other words, it looks like Jesus was against war and against violence, even in self-defense. So that's the main criticism from a pacifist Christian point of view, is that just war theory says war is okay in certain situations, but Jesus didn't seem to think that. Jesus seemed to think violence was always wrong. So you might want to go through my ideas, but I'd like you to try and write up a paragraph on just war theory. The difficulty about the reason you should use just war theory in a question like this, war is always wrong, is because it's the most famous Christian theory about going to war, and therefore it's a glaring absence if you talk about war but you don't mention just war theory. The reason why it's difficult to use just war theory is because it's quite a long theory and complicated theory to explain. It's not as simple as just using a quote from the Bible, which is quite straightforward. It takes a lot of explaining, but it's really important that you know the theory and that you use the theory in questions about war, because it's a really important piece of knowledge that they want you to know. Okay, I think that is everything. It's quite a long video, and I think I've been a bit rambly in this video. So please, if you've got any questions about what I've talked about here, anything that's not clear, put it in the comments when I put this onto the Microsoft Teams. Okay, thanks guys, bye.